Hello modelers, my name is John Fenton and today I'm going to take you through this build of the Wingzy Kits Mitsubishi Claude. We're going to be building this beautiful airplane out of the box with a natural metal finish, and later we'll put together a nice base and paint up some figures. So if that sounds good, grab a beverage, sit back, relax, and let's get into it. So the engine detail is really nice on its own, but we can always add some more. So I added some cables and wiring. So I drilled some holes into this part here very carefully with some micro drill bits, and that allows me to feed in these lead wires with some plastic tubing attached. The plastic tubing is called midge tubing, which you can get from a fly fishing supply shop. Then we just cut down the wires, glue them into place, and we're good to go. So we're just going to prime using Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 black, and when that goes on, it'll just unify the surface, and then we're going to paint it with Mr. Color Super Metallic Fine Silver, and then once that's dry we can put on this black panel line wash from Tamiya. Then paint up the front section. I just use Vallejo model color, and then paint some details, connectors there for the wiring, and then a brown wash again from Tamiya, and then we can just take off the access with a cotton bud. And there's a photo etch frame that goes over the front of the engine that was glued in just using some CA. So then I prepped the exhausts. They were drilled out with my Micromont very carefully, then just primed and then painted with some copper metallics. So I found this one reference picture for the cockpit. I think it's a painting from an old Japanese magazine, but I really liked it, so I decided to use that as the basis for the work I'm going to do. Again, the detail in the cockpit is really good. This aircraft has a very busy office, and that's well represented here in the plastic. A lot of the photo etch for the kit gets used here, so we have to do some modifications. Nothing too difficult, sending off details mostly. I used Mr. Color 126 cockpit color here. I thought that looked like a good match. After painting, just put on a little Tamiya panel line wash and mop that off with a cotton bud. The instrument panel has two parts, the photo etch front and then a clear plastic sheet with the dial details printed on it. So you just need to paint the back of that with some white paint and then cut it down to fit, and you'll end up with a very nice looking instrument panel. More photo etch for the cockpit, the footrests and some extra detail, so these can be put in place with some CA glue, and they fit perfectly. I had no issues at all with the fit in the cockpit. Everything just comes together nice and easily. The same weathering process as before, just a little bit of Tamiya dark brown panel line wash, mopped up with a cotton bud while it's still wet. We can just add some lead wiring here and there just to bring out that extra level of detail. These different consoles on the cockpit walls had cabling coming from them, which disappeared behind the cockpit seat. All of these parts were primed before painting. I wanted to just make sure I had a nice uniform surface for painting, and I'll do that whenever I'm adding a lot of extra detail. The seat section is probably the most important part of the entire cockpit, as it's the most visible. It's the thing that people will see when they look into that tiny little compartment, so I think it's worthwhile spending just a bit of time just to make sure that looks as good as it possibly can. Using our reference, we're just going to add a little bit of plastic sheet to represent the shape of the back section of the seat, and just to mark some holes ready to be drilled out. With the seat belts, these are provided as photo etch parts, and after cleaning up and gluing them together very carefully with some CA, we can paint those up and then carefully attach them to the seat. So I like to glue them in the place where they actually attach to the seat, so at the sides and from behind, and then once that's dry, I carefully bend them into place and try to create that kind of realistic fold in the belt. Just as a finishing touch, a little bit of Panaline wash carefully applied and mopped up straight away. It just gives the belt a tinge of dirt so that they're not looking brand new. Same routine with the rest of the cockpit parts. You can see that Wingsy provide us lots of little parts here to represent the different boxes and compartments and components on the cockpit. The finished article looks really good. Onto the rest of the build, we just need to remove the stubs from the fuselage halves. So we just need to paint a small section of the inside of the fuselage. There are just a few parts that we need to prepare before bringing the two halves together. Final assembly on the cockpit, just glued in place with a little bit of Tamiya Extra Thin. I use Perfect Plastic Putty, which is a water-based filler similar to Vallejo filler. So you just put this on, give it a little time to dry, and then you can clean it up with a cotton bud and water. Onto the wings. Again, just be careful removing the stubs as you want to make sure the surface is nice and level before bringing the wing halves together. I use this Tamiya regular glue on major components like this. So this glue dries slower but will create a stronger bond, and then I'll go through and use Tamiya Extra Thin on the actual seam lines. Horizontal stabilizers and rudder go into place nicely. So one trick I use when finishing my leading edges is to use a Sharpie just to score along the leading edge seam before I start sanding, and that will allow me to see if there's any gaps along that area. There was a little bit of detail that I lost when sanding the bottom section, so there's some rivet lines that you need to follow along the seam line here, so I'm just using some tape to mark that line. I use this rivet wheel when I need long straight lines because the wheel is a little bit bigger than normal. It's much easier to keep it straight. So the last pieces are just put into place. The cockpit is masked off, as well as the ID lights on the wingtips. Liquid latex is your friend here, very useful for masking off strange shaped sections. I use masking fluid from Vallejo. I like the consistency, and you can just put it down and just push it into place with a toothpick. The masks from Dead Designs fit perfectly. Very quick masking job, all done in 5 minutes. The canopy was just painted with the interior colour as a first coat. Because we have a fixed undercarriage on this aircraft, we need to paint the wheels at this stage. I use Mr. Colour number 8 Silver, which is then masked off and then painted with Mr. Colour Tar Black to finish. Once done, the wheels can be glued into the cowling covers. We'll just spend a bit of time just sanding away that front seam. We just want to make sure that disappears completely, and that's easily done using these Tamiya sanding sponges. We just mask off the wheel and with these narrow strips of masking tape, and then we can move on to the next stage. First layer of paint is Mr. Colour GX2, which is a black gloss paint. This is thin, roughly 60% Mr. Leveling thinner to 40% paint, and this stuff goes on really nicely. It's the best paint to use for your metal finish prep, in my opinion. Easy to use, self-levels, and gives you a really nice shiny surface to work from. Atlat paint is extremely thin out of the bottle, so we don't need to thin it, but we can use that low opacity to our advantage. just layering the paint on in subtle patterns allows me to paint the worn sections and newer sections at the same time. Very quickly, and these high shine versions of the paint leave a very thin layer of residue on the surface. So just taking a polishing cloth, or we can rub away that residue or buff it, and that leaves the surface clean and even more shiny and reflective. I'm using these airbrush stencils to create random patterns in the finish. I think I use Altlad polished aluminium for this layer. The whole idea is to create this random pattern. You can create different effects by holding the stencil slightly off the model surface, where you get a more feathered result. And if you hold the stencil right next to the model, the resulting model will be more hard-edged. The decals that come with this kit are very nice, but wherever possible, I'll always look to mask and paint the markings. So the trick here is to take the marking that's been removed from the mask and then place that first. And then you can place it like you would place a decal, and then you can make sure that it's 100% in the correct position. So I used Mr. Color 385 Red, IGN aircraft marking, and it's a great color to use for Japanese markings. I think they've really nailed the tone. Just bear in mind that you'll need quite a few coats on a metal surfaces. If you put too few coats on, you'll end up with a very pink looking finish, which is probably not unrealistic, but if you want a deep red, you're going to need a few coats. So for more of the complicated shapes, I've just put a cellophane bag over the decal sheet, place my masking tape on top of that, and that allows me to easily trace out the shape with a pen. And you can clean up any overspray with a toothpick, just carefully scrape away the paint. It's really easy to add a little bit more variation to the markings while they're masked. So here I'm just adding a slightly darker color and going on the panel lines with that darker color, and that adds just a little bit more depth to the marking.
The decals that come with the kit are very nice. They're thin, but they're not too fragile. They form quite nicely to the surface. I used Mr. Settler and Mr. Softener, and they reacted quite nicely to those solutions. There was a decal for these don't walk lines, but I thought it was just easier just to paint these with a detail brush. I used Evil Sun's Red from Citadel, which is a nice paint to use in these situations. I made a wash using some oil paints and odorless thinner and applied that to the model. I lost this footage unfortunately, but here's me just using a hairdryer to speed up the drying time. Once dry, that can be removed with a dry paper towel. With aircraft modelling, there's always loads of little teeny bits of plastic that needs to be taken care of. I generally wait until I'm waiting for something to dry, so in this case I'm just waiting for my oil wash to dry, and then I can get stuck into all these little parts that just needs to be painted up and weathered separately to the main build. Using that Mr. Color Cowling color again here, I love this color. Probably use it inappropriately most of the time, where another color would be more correct, but if it looks good, I'm happy. Just my modelling philosophy. These external parts all fit really well, and no headaches, which is nice not having to deal with undercarriage issues on an aircraft. So here I'm applying some raw unthinned oil paint. I think I'm using Starship Filth. Oil wash again, this time using light grey and white. Just smudge that onto the piece, wait for it to dry, and then wipe it off again with a dry paper towel. So here I'm applying unthinned oil paints again. I think this time using Burnt Umber from Winsor & Newton. I can put that exactly where I want, and then with my blending brush come back and blend that in, removing probably 95% of the paint and then letting that dry. It doesn't take long to dry, maybe just a few hours. You can come back and do the same thing again. I just build up those layers, and then you can darken the color or you can lighten them and keep going just till you get the effect that you want. One thing to bear in mind when working with oils like this is that the effects, once dry, is going to be very different, much more subtle to how it looks now. Here I'm using a different colour, kind of a dark brown. Here I want to represent dirt and dust being thrown up from the wheel onto the back of the wing. So with all the last remaining parts falling into place, I just need to finish off the propeller. Japanese propellers had this brown colour on the back, and Mr. Colour have a dedicated paint for that, which is called Propeller Brown. There's a few decals to add, and I just like to weather up my propellers just a little bit, a little variation in the paint finish, and usually just use some oils there to dirty things up a bit. ID lights, I'm just using some paint here from my Molotow liquid chrome pen, which is a super high shiny paint, and we let that dry and then go back in with some Tamiya translucent paints. Last thing to add is just the aerial wire or antenna wire, and I'm just using some stretchy string or rigging string, and just a touch with some C8 glue, just attach one end and then with the other. For the base, I use this laser cut carrier deck from LMG, who are another Ukrainian company. Glued that to a piece of pine, and that was cut down into shape with some balsa wood attached for the framing. Once attached, I just sawed off the overlap. The whole thing was then primed with Mr. Surfacer 1500, and that just gives me a nice uniform surface to work from. For the main color, I spray Tamiya deck tan here, but you could use any kind of light sandy color. Japanese carrier decks did have this very distinctive light color, which I wanted to emulate. Brush painted oil paints such as burnt sienna, burnt umber and browns, just to distinguish each of the individual boards in the deck. You could use any kind of paint for this. I use oils here because I thought I could just recreate that timber look. The base color goes on top of that, and just to blend everything in, these tie downs were painted with Tamiya gunmetal. All of this was covered in an oil wash. I think I used Starship Filth for this, so that was mixed with some odorless thinner and spread generously across the surface. Once this is dry, you can just wipe that off with a dry paper towel. So these figures are taken from Tamiya Zero Kit, the A6M5 5A, and that comes with 4 plastic figures. As plastic figures go, these are pretty good. You can just need to take some time to remove those mold lines and fill any gaps. For 148 figures, they're pretty good. They've got nice detail and they go together easily. There are many places on YouTube where you can look up figure painting tutorials. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, just give you a quick overview of what I did. So this process will be familiar to many of you: black primer followed by white paint sprayed from overhead, aka zenithal priming. I'm not going to use glazes or filters, but I do like this method. I'm using Vallejo model colors for this brush painting. These are great paints for figure painting. They have nice coverage, and you can just thin them with a little bit of water and they go on nice and easily. This will be a very basic paint job, but basically I'm just using the darker colors to base with and then work my way to the mid-tones and then finally some highlights. I'm painting those highlights in just a few select areas on raised detail. Very simple, and once you've done this a few times, it does get a lot easier. Figure painting is something I really enjoy and I'm looking forward to doing lots more. You could use a dry brushing technique on this entire figure, but I enjoy doing it the slow way. I also avoid using washes. I think you get a much cleaner final look if you just use the shadow mid-tone highlights method. So I'm just about finished up here, thanks to Wingsy Kits for sending me this model. It's a Gemva kit, I really enjoyed it. It goes together very easily, and I recommend it for beginners and advanced modelers alike. Don't let the photo etch put you off, it's completely optional. And it's a beautiful model to have, especially beside your Mitsubishi Zeros. Thanks so much for watching this far, and if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. There's some amazing builds in the pipeline for Flightline, so stay tuned for those. Thank you to Andrew for forcing me to make this video, Caleb for editing this video, and Al Richardson for some much needed support. I'm John Fenton for Flightline, and you can follow me on Instagram at Kitchen Scale Modeler. We'll see you in the next one.